Hello everyone, today on the Folklore Tree we are going to discuss a brief history of folklore studies, namely the context of how it started and was studied in comparison to the context of today. One of the best ways to understand the present is to examine the past, so let's get started. Now, because we have so much ground to cover and so little time to do it in, we are going to split the next discussion into two parts, starting with the history of folklore studies in the UK and following up next week with the history of folklore studies in America. Now, the word folklore was first coined in 1846 by William John Toms. Prior to this, what we now call folklore was then called popular antiquities or popular literature, but I guess since folklore was less of a mouthful, they decided to go with that. Now, because folklore was drawn from the study of popular antiquities and literature, it makes sense that the earliest definition would refer to the objects and orally transmitted material of people from the working class rural communities, much of which was thought to be under threat of extinction and therefore had to be preserved, mostly by the middle and upper classes. As you'll soon see, socioeconomic class played a major part in how folklore was studied in its early development. As you may remember from our first episode, folklore is not defined this way anymore. Though it does include those things, it is not limited only to those things. Basically, during the 19th century, any material with historical precedent that was considered to be disappearing was ripe for the picking for both professional and hobbyist collectors. Now, the 19th century revival that made studying popular antiquities and literature so popular was in part due to the urbanization movement during the Industrial Revolution. Now, you may have snored through this in history class, but bear with me for a moment, it's important. I'll try to make it brief. The Industrial Revolution began with the invention of the steam-powered engine and the realization that you could power everything from trains to wool mills to factories with it. As more and more factories sprang up in bigger cities across what was the British Empire at the time, more and more jobs were created. The rural people that 19th century folklorists were so interested in were living as subsistence farmers at the time, which, as the name suggests, isn't exactly a lucrative career option. Many such people decided to pack up and seek their fortunes in the big cities rather than to stay in impoverished rural areas to till the land. As a result, urban areas got bigger and bigger and bigger, while rural communities steadily shrank and were swallowed up by the expanding cities. Now, if you were a folklorist in the 19th century but preferred working hands-on in the fields over publishing anthologies Brothers Grimm style, you might hope to work as a social investigator. Social investigators were hired by the British government in order to survey and report on rural culture and living conditions, which more often than not were quite poor. However, social investigators, let's just call them SIs, weren't always totally unbiased in their work. The reports they sent back were often romanticized accounts of rural culture that presented it as permanent, unchanging, and incorruptible, especially in comparison to some of the newer urban cultures that were emerging at the time. The grass is always greener and all that, I guess. Despite their ideas that country life apparently never changed, SIs were definitely noticing that it was changing, and according to them, not in a good way. Country dwellers were often presented as being physically, morally, and culturally superior to their urban counterparts, and yet they seemed to be abandoning their ideal lifestyle for urban lifestyles. Thus, because SIs were convinced that the folk had divested themselves of their ideal lifestyle and culture, they would have to be reintroduced to it. Boom! Instant revival movement. Now, the Industrial Revolution, despite the resulting economic boom, was not an era of rainbows and lollipops. Times were tough, industrial jobs were very dangerous, and too many people were vying for too few jobs for employers who paid very little. And so it makes sense that people would want to harken back to a bygone golden age where times were better and people had more integrity, or so they thought. This is just what people do when the going gets rough, and it's one of the biggest influences on starting and shaping revival movements over the course of history, which we will talk about more in a later episode. I mean, heck, people are still doing it today. I can't even count on one hand how many people I've heard say that today's sorry state of affairs is because of the lack of good old-fashioned family values. At least to me, anyway, it's not that people lack good moral values, it's that our values have changed over time. But that's something to be discussed in more detail later on. Nevertheless, through this account, you can kind of start to see the ways in which history has shaped the way that folklore is studied and perceived in the present. There's far too much history to cover in the course of one video, so next week's video will touch on it a bit more. For now, I hope you enjoyed this little sampler. This has been the Folklore Tree, and I'll see you all next week.